Okay, seems to be slowing down a bit, so why don't we get started? Hey everyone, welcome. My name is Shivangi Dumokos. I'm the Chief of Staff at the California Labor Federation. We're so grateful that you guys have all joined us today for this webinar on our sponsored bill, AB1, authored by Assemblywoman Tina McKinnor, which would give legislative staff the right to join a union and collectively bargain. This is the fifth iteration of this bill that's been introduced, and for a number of legislative staff and our team at the Labor Fed, it's been truly a labor of love to work on this issue because we believe that every single worker in the state deserves the right to have a union if they choose, and legislative staff are no exception. I want to be really clear as we get the discussion started this morning with our wonderful panel of speakers that this webinar is really intended to be a resource for legislative staff who are actually impacted by this bill. This is about helping staff, you all understand what this bill does, the implications it could have for your workplace, and really just to serve as a space where you can safely and anonymously ask questions about this legislation, or at least have a lot of contacts to reach out about it in the future if you have questions. We want to make sure that staff tuning in know that we've gone to great lengths to make sure that your participation can remain anonymous. We did not do a formal registration for this webinar. We will not have a record of who attended. And I think on the back end, our team, Sean has removing participant names so you can't be identified if you ask a question in the chat. So feel free to ask questions throughout and we will answer them at the end. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our author, Assemblywoman Tina McKinnor. We're so lucky to have her as a legislator who's so passionate about this cause. She's leading the way to ensure that this bill passes this year and gets implemented. I know a lot of you probably know Assemblywoman McKinnor was a former staffer herself, a former union staff, a former union member, and unfortunately she wasn't able to make it this morning, but she did send in some remarks so we can hear in her own words why this bill means so much to her. And we also have a special appearance by none other than the Honorable Anthony Rendon, our Speaker in the Assembly. So if we want to play the video, perfect.
Hello, I am Assemblymember Tina McKinnor, and I am honored to be here with Speaker Anthony Rendon to talk about an issue that is important to both of us and the future of California's democracy, giving legislative staff the choice to join a union. AB1 was the first bill introduced this legislative session, and it is not by accident. For far too long, legislative staff have frankly been exploited, accepting low wages and long hours for the chance to help senators and assembly members make important policy changes here in California. I've been a legislative staffer both in the district office and in Sacramento, and I have been a public employee, having worked for DCSS in LA County, and I can tell you this. As a worker, there's nothing scary about joining the union. As an employer, the legislature should not be scared if their staff want to join a union. Unions are an important partner to make sure that we not only hire high quality staff, but that we are paying our staff equitably and that we are taking action to retain our staff and that we make sure that our staff are an active part of building a safe, inclusive culture in the Capitol community. Our staff aren't looking for special treatment. They're looking for the same dignity and respect afforded to all represented workers, period. To the staff in our district offices and the staff in this awe-inspiring building that selflessly serve the people of the state of California every day, know this: we see you and we respect you. And we want you to have a voice in your workplace by creating AB1. The legislature introduced thousands of bills each year, but I am really touched that Speaker Anthony Rendon has joined me today to talk about AB1 and the unionization of the legislative staff. Mr. Speaker is no stranger to the labor movement and the value that unions bring to every workplace. Mr. Speaker, tell us about your background in labor and why you support AB1.
Sure, I have a pretty extensive background in labor, both in terms of my family background and in terms of my work life. I was born on a union strike fund, actually. My dad was on strike in 1968 when I was born, and our hospital bills were paid for my delivery out of the union strike fund. Later on, when I was in graduate school, I helped to organize what is now the UAW union. It reminds me a little bit of this situation in that it was my last year of graduate school, helped to organize the union knowing that I wasn't going to benefit from it because I graduated. And then later joined the California Faculty Association as a member. And every single time I ran a nonprofit organization, whether it was AFT or SEIU, all of my employees, all of my staff were always unionized as well.
Okay, Mr. Speaker, tell us about your background and what you did in labor, and why do you support AB1?
Well, I support AB1, first of all, because I think everyone should have the right to join a union. I think in the case of our staff, our incredibly talented staff, our staff that works really hard, they should definitely have the opportunity to join a union. I think it's, honestly, the height of hypocrisy for a legislative body that stands for labor rights. It stands for the ideals of unions to not have unionized workforce. I think that's very important that we do that.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is extremely personal to me as well. I've been a staffer, like I said, and I've also been work for a union. And I'm just so proud of your leadership and standing with us and standing with staff. A lot of work that we do here in Sacramento is bipartisan in nature. And I'm proud to announce that AB1 currently has 37 co-authors, including 2 Republican co-authors. The strong showing of early support is important because we know what a challenging workplace this can be at times, and we want staff to know that we stand with you. And I am confident that this year will be the year that AB1 will cross the finish line, and I'm excited that we could do it with bipartisan support. So, Mr. Speaker, again, thank you for your words today and for your incredible service to the state of California and for standing up with staff and with me by supporting AB1. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you.
There you go. Now you all know what a personal undertaking this is for Assemblywoman McKinnor, how much it means to her, and why she won't stop until this gets done. And for legislative staff who tuned in, especially in the Assembly, I hope everyone is really encouraged by that clear statement of support from Speaker Rendon, who's actually walking the walk when he says he believes every worker deserves the right to join a union and supports AB1. So next up, it's my pleasure to introduce Kent Wong, Director of the UCLA Labor Center, who is such a wealth of knowledge. We're so lucky to have him here today to provide his expertise and perspective on why this fight for union rights and arguments we often hear against it really isn't anything brand new. Thanks so much for being here, Kent.
Thanks for having me, Shubhangi, and so great that we have such a good turnout today. I'm the director of the UCLA Labor Center, where I teach labor studies and ethnic studies. I'm also a vice president of the California Federation of Teachers, and I served as a staff attorney for the Service Employees International Union, Local 7-1. As all of you have heard, 48,000 graduate student workers launched the largest strike in the history of higher education in the United States. And they won a 46% wage and benefit increase across the board. That's an extraordinary victory, and it bodes well for the future of the California labor movement, because these 48,000 graduate students will soon be entering the workforce themselves and will be either working here within higher education or getting jobs in government, in the public sector, in the private sector, and everywhere they go, they will be bringing union consciousness with them. Now, the legislative aides play an indispensable role within the California state legislature. In many instances, especially with term limits, you provide the institutional memory, you know how the building works, you know how to move legislation, you know how to make a difference in the success or failure of the California state legislature. And you are absolutely workers, and you absolutely deserve union recognition, union representation. There is a myth that somehow says that if we can work our legislative aides to death, if we can extract 80, 100 hours each week from them, that somehow this is a good thing. We think that you can be highly productive, you can be highly effective at your job without working outrageous unpaid overtime. And so I do think that there are direct interests to the legislative aides to organize, to demand a fair work week, to demand living wages, and to have the collective power that only unions can provide. It is remarkable that the Speaker of the Assembly, Anthony Rendon, is supporting AB1 and supporting the unionization of legislative staff. It is remarkable that Assemblymember Tina McKinnor is moving this forward. These are two labor champions. Assemblymember McKinnor herself has been a legislative aide and knows how hard this job is. So we applaud you, we support you. We are very excited that due to the support from the California State Legislature, we are in a growth mode within the labor centers of the University of California. And so all throughout the University of California system, we will have labor faculty who will be advocates for unions, advocates for organizing, advocates for worker power. And so please feel free to reach out to me at the UCLA Labor Center. I support you. We will work with you to ensure this union organizing campaign succeeds. And that's true with my colleagues throughout the University of California system. If the 48,000 graduate student workers can do it, so can you. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for sharing that perspective, Kent. I just want to say, I know so many of you tuned in may have been a member of a union in the past or have family members who belong to unions, but I also know a lot of you out there may not have had personal interaction with unions or the labor movement at large. It's why we're here today doing this, but it's also why I'm so excited to introduce you all to the Labor Federation's organizing director, Chloe Osmer. Chloe previously worked for the Labor Commissioner, and she's an expert on labor law enforcement, but prior to that, she has had a long history of organizing in the labor movement. She knows what it takes to help workers unionize their workplace, and she is an amazing resource and person that you all should know. She is going to cover the basics of why unions matter, what they're all about, and why we fight so hard to make sure every single worker who wants one can have one. Go ahead, Chloe.
Thanks so much, Shubhangi. So my name is Chloe Osmer. I'm organizing director for the California Labor Federation, as Shubhangi said. I've worked in the labor movement for close to 20 years. And while I've helped workers form unions at lots of different workplaces, I've also been a proud union member as a union staff person myself. And I, as Shubhangi said, I am also a firm believer that every person in every profession in this state should have the right to form a union if they choose to. So I'm really happy to be here today to talk to you all about this bill. And I want to take a second to just talk a little bit about what the California Labor Federation does. Some of you may be familiar, some of you may not, but we're the umbrella organization for unions all across California. Unions that represent teachers, state employees, nurses, farm workers, musicians, janitors, attorneys, you name it. And some of the unions that make up the Federation are very large and have tens of thousands of members, but others are very small and have less than a few dozen members. And you probably have interacted with our team on legislation that deals with workers' rights, but that's just one part of what the Federation does. We also help workers in those unions when they're negotiating collective bargaining agreements to improve their working conditions, when they want to vote in elected officials who will listen to their concerns as workers, and of course, to pass laws to better protect workers on the job. But we also, and this is where my department comes in, we help workers who want to have a union but don't yet have one. So most of you probably know support for unions is in the US is around 71%, which is a 57-year high. And it increased pretty significantly during the pandemic. So why is this? We can look at two different things. Frequently we talk about the union difference, which is the statistics show us that being a union member means on average, you earn more than your non-union counterparts. This starts at around 11% more, but is much higher for people of color, for example, that union difference. You're much more likely to have access to healthcare and other benefits like pensions. So pretty much across the board, you see a big difference in conditions in the workplace when you have a union versus when you don't. And the way you get those higher wages and benefits, and again, this may be something that most of you are familiar with, but not for others. Having a union allows you to bargain collectively with your coworkers and your employer on a contract that lays out your working conditions. So this isn't just wages, but it's also things like your working hours, protection from unfair treatment, safety protocols. And once you have that contract, you vote on it, first of all. And once it's agreed upon, there is a grievance and arbitration process. And that's a straightforward way to resolve any issues or violations of the contract. The union and the employer agree to that as part of the contract. There's usually pretty strict process, and it's a much faster and more effective way to resolve issues in the workplace than, for example, having to pursue a claim in court or seek government enforcement assistance. So that's one of the reasons people want to form unions. But the second reason that support for unions is so high right now might be a little less obvious. And I've been part of many organizing campaigns. And then I would say the number one reason that people tell me that they want to form a union in their workplace, while they care about getting better pay and having safer working conditions, one of the most common things I hear people tell me is that they want respect on the job. They want to be able to have a say in their workplace and not just have their concerns ignored when it's not convenient for their employer to address them. And that basic respect and dignity on the job is a huge part of why people come together to form unions with their coworkers. So I just want to say, forming a union in your work doesn't mean that you have to agree with everything that California Labor Federation or other unions advocate for when we advocate to protect workers in the legislature. We worked in the past with journalists at the Los Angeles Times and other outlets that formed a union. They were super clear that, them organizing into a union, forming a union in their workplace, including one that was part of a federation, didn't mean that they were influenced by the political views of that federation. And in fact, part of the reason they were forming a union was to have a say in their workplace when it meant that they could ensure their journalistic integrity when decisions were being made that could compromise it. So giving up, having a union does not mean in any way giving up your autonomy to make political decisions. Unions are democratic institutions. You can, if you have the right to form one, you can choose to join an existing union, or workers often can form their own. And you vote on your collective bargaining agreements, and you can elect and unelect your leaders. So the last thing I will say is that while it can be kind of nerve-wracking at times to form a union for the first time, it's an incredibly powerful feeling to be able to stand together with your coworkers, to know that they have your back and that you have more strength collectively than you do on your own. And I've seen workplaces that were really permeated by fear of retaliation, for speaking out, be transformed when workers formed a union and created checks and balances on that power. It's not magic, and it's not just because you get the right on paper. You have to be engaged in your union, but when you are, it can fundamentally change your workplace, and not just for you, but for those who may come after you in these jobs. So congratulations on the introduction of this bill, and know that the California Labor Federation supports your right to form a union, and that you have a whole movement of people supporting you.
Thank you so much for that overview, Chloe. I'm going to take some time just get into why the California Labor Federation believes this legislation is worth fighting for, and just get into more of the specifics on the policy side and some questions that I often get from staff. And just so you guys all have a little bit of background about me and what's shaped my perspective on this issue, I worked in the legislature as a legislative aide and later as a chief of staff. So I kind of have that perspective of having been a rank and file worker and a manager. But to drill down on really the basics of what this bill really comes down to, I think it's three things: choice, parity, and respect. This bill does not give legislative staff a union. It does not impose a new kind of structure on you. It only grants each of you the right to decide if that's what you want in your workplace. It gives you the freedom to make that choice without intimidation or fear of retaliation. And it actually empowers you all as a group to go through a democratic workplace election process, like Chloe was saying, to make that collective decision if you want. As many of you know, the DILS Act was passed in 1977, granting state employees the right to collectively bargain, and legislative employees were excluded from that statute. And since then, the legislature has passed many additional collective bargaining statutes that extend those rights to other groups of public employees. But of today, it's just leaving the legislature as the only branch of California government whose employees aren't allowed to come together to make a decision for yourselves about having a union in your workplace. And not only that, you're actually exempt from a bulk of labor laws that the legislature passes for the private and the rest of the public sector, which is another reason why it's even more challenging to create uniformity of labor standards for staff when so many of the rules are actually self-determined by the institution and they change regularly. And the last point that I want to make about respect is just that you deserve the simple recognition that while, of course, working in the legislature is certainly a unique experience, there is not a legitimate argument to be made, in my opinion, that being a staffer is so different from the experience of every single other worker that you shouldn't get this fundamental right of having a voice on the job, just like every other worker does. And while it is, I recognize it's a privilege to be a public servant working in the legislature. It's excruciatingly difficult work. It's long hours. It demands, an above and beyond level of dedication, especially these last 3 years that you guys have all helped your bosses navigate and govern during this pandemic. And staff who are entrusted with these incredibly high stakes decisions, recommendations, meaningful responsibilities, you all should be trusted to provide input in shaping your workplace and what it looks like, and knowing that you can exercise that right responsibly. So I know there's a lot of questions about the policy itself, and let's talk about who it doesn't cover. AB 1 does not extend collective bargaining rights to legislators, to appointed officers, so that's the Secretary of the Senate and the Chief Clerk of the Assembly. It does not extend rights to confidential employees whose job it is basically to develop management positions, and it excludes chiefs of staff and chief consultants. All other staff are employed by the Assembly and Senate are covered by this bill. I get questions often about district directors, district staff, legislative directors. All of those categories are covered by this bill. The actual framework of the language, it's modeled after other existing public sector collective bargaining statutes. We wanted to follow existing precedent as what's already an existing law, and we've just made a few additional changes to make sure that the bill is tailored appropriately to the legislature. So getting into more of the little details, the bill itself, so under the bill, the Public Employment Relations Board, which is PERB, establishes the actual procedures for you all as staff to petition to unionize. They would establish the procedures for an election in the workplace, how different bargaining units are established, and actually the process by which the union would be formally recognized as an exclusive representative of a bargaining unit. So when PERB is going through this process, especially of establishing these brand new bargaining units, what they're going to do is they're going to consider similarities between different groups of employees, like common skills, common working conditions, common job duties, so that you are bargaining with a group of people with similar professional interests as you. So right now, legislators, you guys know, legislators take votes on legislation that are actually outlining a memorandum of understanding between a union and the state representing a group of state workers. So similarly, under AB 1, if an election were to take place to form a union, the legislature engaged in bargaining and they actually came to an agreement, what would happen then is that a memorandum of understanding would be voted on as a resolution to ratify that agreement. AB 1 also specifies in the language that any memorandum of understanding, or MOU, I'll just say for short, has to adhere to the legislature's capped budget under Prop 140. I get a lot of questions about this, so let's spend a little bit of time on that. The answer is really simple about how collective bargaining works when there's a strict cap on the budget. I mean, you all get raises every few years, some more than others. It's not necessarily applied as an equitable process right now, but that does happen. And the answer is simple in how this would work under a capped budget is because all employers, especially in the public sector, have to adhere to a finite budget, and they can't bargain monetary increases that exceed a certain amount, and the legislature is no different. So none of that has to do with the fact that employees should have a say in how the overall pie budgeted for wages and benefits and supplies is divided up. A union gives you a voice in how that is divided up. There is also an entire section in the bill that prohibits explicitly the legislature from engaging in any union busting activities, in engaging in retaliation against staff for exercising their rights under the bill or refusing to bargain in good faith. And finally, there's a 6-month delay in implementation as the bill is written now. So if it were to be passed, it wouldn't go into effect until July 2024. And the last thing I'll say on the language is just that the author plans to make an amendment to clarify that this would actually, if it were passed and implemented, it would be a joint agreement or a joint MOU, so that Assembly staff and Senate staff would be subject to and governed by the same collective bargaining agreement. So that's a little bit about the mechanics of how the bill would work. But as you can tell from everything I just went through, the bill itself is not actually that prescriptive about how your workplace would change as a result of unionization. And that's because it's really up to you all as workers to decide what your priorities are, what your demands would be. And so a lot of the details we don't know about as far as implementation goes, because it remains to be determined by all of you what direction you want to go in. I just want to speak really briefly about a legislative survey or a survey of legislative staff that the California Labor Federation did last year about how staff felt about their workplace. And a sample of 400 staffers who completed the entire survey included schedulers, district field reps, legislative aides, communications aides, committee secretaries, committee consultants, legislative directors, district directors, and sergeants, both in the Assembly and the Senate. Roughly about 60% of the respondents had worked in the legislature for 5 years or less, and 40% worked in the legislature for more than 6 years, and actually 25% of that group had worked in the legislature for more than 9 years. The top 3 issues I just want to say that we got coming out of that survey that staff talked about wanting to address and influence if they had a union in the workplace were wages, working conditions, and protections against retaliation and unfair treatment. The beauty of a collective bargaining agreement is that, and the reason why you'll often see in bills that include an exemption from employer mandates for workers who are covered by a CBA, is that the legislature and staff actually have the flexibility to work through each side's priorities to decide what are the necessary fixes together that fit the nuances, that fit the quirks of the legislature as a workplace. Both sides are going to have demands. Both sides are going to have to do give and take, and both sides don't have to agree to something that they can't live with. Like Chloe mentioned, this is a democratic process. One myth that I've heard from a number of staff that I just want to address briefly is that I've heard that folks say a union in the workplace and a collective bargaining agreement would not make the legislature more equitable, and it would not benefit all workers the same. Now, I'm going to say this is patently untrue, and I want to briefly use an example of wages and the issue of pay equity to explain why. One of the benefits of a CBA is that it actually does create uniform standards in the workplace that applies to everybody. A CBA that includes a wage scale is the most effective approach to ensuring that staff with similar seniority, similar job duties, similar workloads are paid equitably. From the survey that I was mentioning earlier, 80% of staff who responded said that they have opted in their experience as employees not to communicate concerns about workplace conditions to their respective rules committee. I totally understand when you're an at-will employee and working in an institution with 120 different bosses, you never know what the outcome is going to be or what the repercussions are going to be when you make a workplace complaint. So I understand that fear. And the benefit of having a union is that where the union actually has a duty of fair representation to every single one of its members, is that they represent staff grievances. And if any of the workplace standards outlined in a CBA aren't being enforced, they can enforce that. And the very last point I want to make about why AB1 matters is really about empowering staff and how that actually benefits the entire institution and public policy overall. I know Kent started to mention that. I know you all would not have gone into public service if you weren't deeply committed to this work, but I mean, the increased brain drain that we've been seeing in the legislature, the high turnover rates, the lack of retention, it's a huge loss in institutional knowledge that actually makes it more difficult to have a productive public policy process. Having good experienced staff makes legislators more effective. It makes them better at passing better legislation, better quality legislation. I want to mention too, from our survey from legislative staff who responded, nearly 70% claimed that they do not plan to continue employment in the legislature in the next 5 years. They plan to leave. 42% of legislative staff said they saw themselves leaving their jobs in the legislature within 2 years or less. And unions are proven in the workplace to both increase productivity, to improve long-term retention, because, I mean, of course, ultimately job satisfaction goes up across the board when workers have a say in shaping their workplace. It's been really exciting to see that the tides are shifting in recent years with legislative staff all over the country. I'm sure you all have seen standing up for their rights to unionize, including legislative staff in the Oregon and Washington legislature, in the US House, and as of this week in the US Senate too. I think staffers are recognizing the value of your labor, and it's really, really incredible to see this surge in organizing. So I just want to say, I believe that with the leadership of Assemblywoman McKinnor, Speaker Anthony Rendon, Senate leadership, and the force of the entire labor movement standing with all of you, we are going to pass AB1. We can take some questions now if folks want to put any in the chat. Let's see. I think we may have addressed most of these. If anybody wants to put any questions in the chat, or we'll also put all of our contact information in the chat so you all can reach out to us privately. I really appreciate you all tuning in. I hope this was informative and helped address some of your questions. And for those of you who do want this bill to pass, even your silent support is so meaningful. It's incredibly brave of you who have tried to advocate for this bill. It has made all the difference in getting this bill to this point. I really appreciate all our speakers for taking the time today to talk about their support for AB1. And if you all reach out to us as the Labor Federation, as an individual and not on behalf of your bosses, we will not reveal your identity. So feel free to consider us a resource if you just have more questions that you would like us to address or talk through. But really appreciate everybody's time. Thanks, everybody. Oh, wait. I've seen a lot of questions come in. Okay. I see a question that says, how can we better explain to LDs or chiefs that this does cover them? So it does apply to legislative directors. It does not apply to chiefs. So I wanted to clarify on that. Do we have yes on AB1 signs yet? We will get them delivered to your office. Can we begin signing union cards or taking beginning steps so that when the law hopefully passes, there is already groundwork ready? I would just say that the benefit of AB1 is that there are legal protections in the legislation for organizing that don't exist right now. But nothing is stopping you from talking to your coworkers about your working conditions. We'll just say that. I think we have seen a lot of questions about the cap on the legislature's budget, which I addressed earlier. Staff are leaving because they want a flexible work schedule and work from home when needed. Could a staff union help with that? A staff union can prioritize whatever the members want it to prioritize. If that's something that the bulk of staffers want to address, that can be in your list of priorities. That is absolutely something. If you want to fight for that, that is, your union is you and your coworkers. If that's a priority for you all, absolutely. I think if there's a need for testimony or support from district staff, I would be happy to participate. That's very sweet. Thank you, guys. I'm going to leave my contact information in the chat, or if somebody could put it in the chat, that would be awesome. I'd be happy to follow up with you all one-on-one. Okay. Here, let me see. I think folks are getting their questions in, so I'm gonna. Yes, what steps should we take to prepare for the possibility of AB1 passing? I mean, think about, what do you want to change in your workplace if you had the opportunity? What's something that you and your colleagues agree on that you think needs to change, especially having worked through a pandemic? I think just having conversations and building camaraderie and solidarity with your coworkers is the most important thing that you could be doing. Since there are special rules for schedulers, will schedulers be covered? Yes. How do you believe the economic deficit will impact this? I will say, I mean, the legislature's budget is determined by, it is predetermined, so you have to work within those parameters, and the bill does clarify that. And that will not change. So I think a lot of workers are dealing with that as they're going into contract negotiations as union members. Sorry, I'm trying to keep up. How will this bill affect district staff that work more than 40 hours? It depends how you're classified. If you're an hourly employee versus an exempt salaried employee. If you are salaried, then you would not receive overtime for working more than 8 hours in a day or 40 hours a week. But there are issues like comp time that you could prioritize in bargaining. There is also a law that does not currently apply to the legislature, which is that salaried employees have to make twice the minimum wage. So that is something that impacts salaried workers and could impact your salary. These are all really wonderful questions. I just want to say I'll give it another couple minutes to answer a couple last ones, but we are also happy to send out an FAQ kind of very specific to what everything that folks are sending in. There's a lot of common questions on Prop 140 and how that works. We will absolutely send you all an FAQ following this. Can we fight to become paid hourly workers? Through a democratic process, you all can decide to vote on making that one of your demands if you choose. Are there any major differences from the bill last year and this year? There are not, with the exception of what I already mentioned, which is that there will be an amendment to make it so that there's a joint MOU that covers both houses. It would standardize the agreement and labor standards between two houses, as opposed to those two things happening separately. So as opposed to the Assembly staff only bargaining with the Assembly and the Senate staff only bargaining with the Senate. What is the statistic of staffers who hold a second job to afford to live? Managing two jobs and the additional non-paid hours in the legislature is so difficult and tiring. I am totally sympathetic and understand how difficult that can be. At least in our, I can't speak for the entire workforce, but in the survey that we did of 400 staffers, 1 in 4 said that they had an additional job outside of the legislature to make ends meet for basic necessities like rent, groceries, etc. Okay, I think I'm gonna leave that there with that being our last question. Thank you guys all for participating, for joining. We're going to tailor our next FAQs to all of the questions that were just raised right now. Thank you so much. It really means a lot. Thanks, everybody.